What if I told you that medieval women were deliberately poisoning their faces, plucking their hairlines backward, and considering pale skin a status symbol so powerful it could bankrupt a family? Here's a fact that will blow your mind. The same cosmetics used to achieve these looks often contained mercury, lead, and arsenic. According to historical records from the period, beauty rituals that seem like torture today were not just accepted, they were essential. If that just made you wince a little, then you're going to absolutely hate what's coming next, because the medieval idea of beauty wasn't just different from ours, it was genuinely dangerous. Teeth whitening pastes made from brick dust, eyebrows plucked so far back they disappeared entirely, skin treatments so toxic that they left permanent scars. And the wildest part? Women knew these things were poisoning them. They did it anyway, because in medieval times, beauty wasn't a choice. It was survival. Tonight, we're diving into the uncomfortable, the bizarre, and the genuinely alarming world of medieval beauty standards. And trust me, you're going to want to stay till the end. Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of medieval beauty standards, the rituals, the risks, and the rules that shaped how women saw themselves for centuries. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what we're about to explore isn't just about vanity. It's about power, status, and how far people will go to fit into a world that was never designed for their comfort. So let's start with something that seems simple on the surface, but becomes absolutely wild once you understand what was really happening. All right, here's where things get interesting. When you think of medieval beauty, you might picture soft, natural features, maybe some light makeup. Nothing too extreme. But actually, the reality was the complete opposite. Medieval women were engaged in some of the most aggressive eye modification you could imagine. And it all started with a concept that sounds almost reasonable: defined eyes. But the way they achieved definition would make modern beauty influencers cringe. Let's start with eyebrows, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Picture this. You're a woman in 13th century Florence or 14th century England. You're considered beautiful. Your eyebrows are high, thin, and barely visible, plucked so far back that your forehead appears enormous. Not just a little plucked. I'm talking about eyebrows that have been methodically removed until they practically start at your hairline. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional, repeated, painful, and essential to being considered attractive. According to beauty treatises from the period, a woman's eyebrows should be thin as threads, or ideally, barely present at all. The reasoning? A high forehead was associated with intelligence, nobility, and purity. So to achieve this, women would pluck not just their natural eyebrows, but also the hair directly above them, extending the visible forehead upward by an inch or more. Now, you might think, okay, that's just plucking. Painful, sure. But people pluck today. Except medieval women weren't using tweezers. They were using shells, razors, or walnut oil mixed with vinegar as a depilatory. Some used pumice stones. Others used a technique called threading, pulling hair out with twisted thread. Imagine doing that repeatedly over the years On the most sensitive part of your face, the skin would become raw, scarred, and sometimes infected. And yet, the moment your eyebrows started to grow back, you'd have to do it again. Because visible eyebrows? That was basically admitting you weren't trying, that you didn't care about your status. Here's where it gets worse. Some women didn't stop at their natural brows. They continued plucking the skin itself, creating a completely bare forehead that extended almost to their hairline. Contemporary sources suggest that, in some circles, this look was so desirable that women would apply caustic substances to the area to prevent regrowth entirely. We're talking about chemicals that would burn the skin. Modern historians have found evidence of cosmetic recipes that included sulfur, lime, and other corrosive materials explicitly meant for permanent hair removal. The side effect: permanent scarring, thinning skin, and in some cases, partial loss of sensation in the forehead area. But beauty demanded sacrifice, so women sacrificed. The fascinating and, honestly, kind of disturbing part is that this trend wasn't universal. In some regions, fuller eyebrows were acceptable, even desirable, but in the courts of Northern Europe and Italy, especially among the nobility, the plucked, nearly invisible eyebrow became the ultimate marker of refinement. You could literally look at a woman's forehead and know her social status. If she had eyebrows, she was probably not nobility. If her forehead was a smooth, bare expanse, she was either wealthy enough to maintain this look obsessively or desperate enough to try to fake it. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about individual vanity. It was about signaling to the world that you had the time, resources, and pain tolerance to pursue beauty standards. In a medieval society where most people were exhausted, dirty, and focused on survival, a woman with a perfectly plucked, high forehead was basically saying, I have servants, I have leisure, I have access to beauty products. It was an advertisement of wealth and status written on her face. It's like if today you walked around with a designer bag that cost more than your rent, everyone would know what you were communicating, whether you meant to or not. Now let's talk about what was actually happening around those brutally plucked eyebrows, the eyes themselves. And this is where medieval beauty standards became genuinely theatrical. The eyes were the focal point, the theater of the face, and they had to be emphasized in a particular way. This is where Kohl came in, but not the Kohl you might be imagining from modern makeup tutorials. Medieval Kohl was primarily made from one substance, lampblack, the black soot that accumulated in oil lamps and candles. This wasn't cosmetic grade anything. This was basically soot. Merchants would scrape it from lamps, mix it with various oils, sometimes rose oil, sometimes almond oil, sometimes just regular animal fat, and that became your eye makeup. According to beauty manuscripts from the period, this mixture was applied around the eyes in specific patterns. The upper lid would have a thick line, creating definition and making the eyes appear larger. The lower lid would also be lined, but sometimes with a lighter application. The goal was to make the eyes stand out dramatically from the pale face surrounding them. But here's what makes this different from modern eyeliner. The application wasn't precise. There were no brushes like we have today. Women would use sharpened sticks, their fingers, or small applicators made from bird quills. The line was often thick and somewhat rough, which actually created an intensity that modern makeup rarely achieves. When you look at portraits from the period, the eyes seem to stare out at you with an almost hypnotic quality, and a lot of that was the Kohl. It made the eyes appear larger, darker, and more alive than they actually were. In a world where women were often supposed to be demure and quiet, the eyes became the one place where you could express intensity, intelligence, and presence. The problem was consistency. Lampblack isn't stable. It smudges, it runs, it flakes off throughout the day. So medieval women would need to reapply it constantly. Historical records suggest that women of means kept small containers of Kohl with them at all times. They'd touch it up in the morning, after meals, before social gatherings. It became part of the daily routine, like brushing your teeth, except it took longer and looked more dramatic. And if you were poor, you might have access to Kohl only on special occasions, which meant your eyes would have that defined look for a wedding or a festival, and then back to normal the rest of the time. That visual contrast, going from dramatic to plain, was itself a statement about your status. Now, there's an interesting variation here. While Kohl was the primary eye makeup, lighter liners were also used, particularly around the inner eye. According to beauty treatises, a thin line of a lighter color, sometimes made from gum arabic mixed with crushed minerals, would be applied to the inner rim of the lower eyelid. This created an optical illusion of larger, brighter eyes. It's actually the same technique used in modern makeup tutorials when beauty influencers talk about making eyes look more awake. Medieval women figured this out centuries ago. They didn't have YouTube, but they had the same understanding of how light and shadow work on the human face. But here's where it gets complicated. The emphasis on the eyes wasn't just about making them look bigger or brighter. It was also about the emotional weight they carried. In medieval theology and philosophy, the eyes were the windows to the soul. A woman's gaze was considered powerful, potentially dangerous even. The concept of the evil eye was real and feared across medieval Europe. A woman who looked at you directly, especially with lined, emphasized eyes, was making a statement. She was claiming a kind of power, and the more dramatic her eye makeup, the more intentional that claim became. Some conservative religious authorities actually preached against eye makeup for this reason. They saw it as a form of seduction or even witchcraft. This created an interesting dynamic in medieval society. Women were supposed to be modest and obedient, but their beauty standards demanded that they emphasize their eyes, the most expressive part of their face. This was a contradiction that women navigated constantly. You had to look beautiful, which meant dramatic eyes, but not too bold about it. It was a balance that basically couldn't be achieved, which meant women were always failing in someone's eyes, and they did it anyway. The application process itself was a ritual. Picture a noble woman in her chamber in the morning, sitting by a window for natural light. A servant would hand her a small dish of Kohl, and she'd dip a quill or stick into it. The application was careful, intentional, and almost meditative. It was a moment of privacy, of control over her own appearance, in a world where most things about her life were controlled by others. The Kohl line was one of the few things a medieval woman could adjust, modify, or perfect on her own terms. And if she messed up, she could try again. There was power in that, even in something as seemingly superficial as eye makeup. By the late medieval period, The eye makeup techniques had become even more sophisticated in wealthier circles. Some women were using layers of kohl as the base, then a lighter shade was applied on top, creating dimension and depth. Some were experimenting with different colors. While black was standard, some beauty recipes mentioned alternatives like dark blue or brown, made by mixing lampblack with crushed minerals or plant matter. These variations were subtle, but they allowed for individual expression within a rigid framework. You had to wear kohl, which was non-negotiable, but you could play with the shade, the thickness, the application pattern. That small freedom mattered. Here's the thing that really gets you when you think about it. All of this, the plucking, the scarring, the daily application of soot, was in service of a beauty standard that actively worked against women's comfort and individuality. And yet women embraced it, maintained it, passed it on to the next generation, because the alternative was to be seen as unkempt, low status, or unwilling to participate in the rituals that marked you as civilized and worthy. It's not so different from today. When you think about it, we just don't scarify our foreheads anymore. But the basic truth remains the same. Beauty standards require sacrifice, and women have learned to sacrifice. Little did medieval women know that their elaborate eye makeup rituals were setting a template that would persist for centuries, constantly reinventing itself, but always demanding the same thing, that women hurt themselves to be considered beautiful. And honestly, that pattern never really went away. But wait, there's more to the story of medieval eye aesthetics, because the eyebrows in Kohl were only half the equation. The real obsession was with the shape and size of the eye itself, and this is where medieval beauty standards become genuinely bewildering to modern sensibilities. Medieval beauty ideals dictated that eyes should be almond-shaped, large, and what we might now call doe-like, wide-set, with a gentle, downward slope at the outer corner. The problem? Most people don't naturally have this eye shape, so women had to create the illusion through makeup application, and in some cases, through actual physical manipulation of the eye area. Let me explain what I mean. Some beauty manuscripts from the period describe techniques for making the eyes appear wider and more almond-shaped through careful kohl placement and the use of lighter shades. The technique involved extending the kohl line slightly upward and outward at the corners, creating a subtle wing effect. But here's where it gets darker. Some sources suggest that women would actually use needles or sharp implements to create small scars or marks at the outer corners of the eyes, which would then be lined with kohl. The scarring would create a permanent line that made the eye appear lifted and more almond-shaped. Whether this was common practice or just mentioned in one particularly extreme beauty guide is unclear, but the fact that it was written down at all tells you something about how far women were willing to go. According to historians' notes on medieval cosmetic practices, some women would also apply caustic substances around the eye area to tighten the skin, creating a more lifted appearance. The risk of this was obvious: permanent damage to the delicate skin around the eyes, potential blindness if the substance got into the eye itself, scarring that would be visible for life. And yet, these recipes were preserved, copied, and shared. Women knew the risks. They did it anyway. Now there's another element to eye aesthetics that's often overlooked: the eyeball itself. Medieval writers were obsessed with the color and clarity of the eyes. Dark eyes were considered most beautiful. Black or very dark brown, blue eyes were acceptable in Northern Europe, but were sometimes viewed with suspicion in Mediterranean regions, associated with foreigners or people of questionable lineage. Green eyes were rare and often considered strange or even witchy. But what mattered most wasn't the natural color of your eyes. It was the clarity and brightness of the whites of your eyes. Here's where hygiene became a beauty issue. A woman with red, irritated, or yellowed eyes was considered ugly and unhealthy. So, maintaining clear, bright whites became essential. This meant careful cleaning, avoiding irritants, and sometimes using herbal rinses to keep the eyes clear. Contemporary sources suggest that women would rinse their eyes with rose water, chamomile infusions, or other gentle herbal solutions. This wasn't just cosmetic, it was actually somewhat practical. These herbal rinses did help reduce inflammation and keep the eyes healthier, but the motivation wasn't health. It was beautiful. You needed clear eyes to be considered attractive, so you maintained them like you'd maintain any other valuable possession. Some beauty recipes from the period mention using very dilute solutions of toxic substances around the eyes. I'm talking about things like belladonna, deadly nightshade diluted in rose water and applied as an eye wash, or even used to dilate the pupils. Medieval women knew that dilated pupils made the eyes appear larger and more attractive. What they might not have fully understood was that belladonna is literally poison. Even in dilute form, repeated exposure could cause serious harm. But the beauty standard demanded it, so women used it. There are historical accounts of women going partially or fully blind from these eye treatments, and the tragedy of it is that they probably knew the risk. They made a calculation that beauty and status were worth the possibility of blindness. The real genius of medieval eye makeup wasn't just the application technique, it was the psychology behind it. By emphasizing the eyes so dramatically, medieval beauty standards effectively silenced women's mouths. Think about it. If your face is carefully constructed so that all attention is drawn to your eyes, then your words become secondary. Your gaze becomes your primary form of communication. This was probably intentional. Honestly, a society that wanted women to be beautiful but quiet could achieve that by making their eyes the focal point. You could look at a medieval woman's carefully lined, coal-darkened eyes and read intelligence, emotion, and presence, but only if you were looking at her face. If you were looking at her mouth, listening to her words, you were missing the point. The beauty standard was literally designed to redirect attention away from what she might say. But here's the thing about human psychology. You can't completely silence someone by making them beautiful. The more a medieval woman invested in her eye makeup, the more intentional she became about her appearance, the more conscious she was of how she was being perceived. And that consciousness is a form of power. Even if it's limited, she wasn't just being looked at. She was managing how she was being looked at. She was choosing which version of herself to present. That's agency, even if it's constrained agency. By the later medieval period, the techniques had become even more refined. In 15th century courts, especially in Italy and Burgundy, women were using multiple layers of different products around the eyes. A base of kohl, then a lighter shade of mineral-based powder to create depth, then sometimes a thin line of a contrasting color to emphasize the upper lid. Some women were experimenting with what we might call eyeshadow crushed minerals, mixed with oil or gum to create color that could be applied to the eyelid. These weren't permanent. They'd wash off or fade throughout the day. But for a few hours, a woman could transform her face. She could make her eyes appear deeper, larger, and more mysterious. And when the makeup faded, she could reapply it. There was a kind of freedom in the knowledge that your face could be different tomorrow, that you weren't trapped in whatever appearance you were born with. Of course, this freedom came at a cost. The daily ritual of applying and reapplying eye makeup was time-consuming. If you were a noble woman, you probably had servants to help. If you were middle class or aspiring to nobility, you'd have to do it yourself, stealing time from other tasks. If you were poor, you might only have access to Kohl on special occasions, which meant your face would be one version most days and dramatically different on festival days or when you needed to make an impression. That visible difference was itself a form of social commentary. Everyone could see that you were making an effort for a specific occasion. Everyone knew what you were trying to do. The psychological toll of maintaining these eye aesthetics shouldn't be underestimated. Medieval women had to constantly think about their appearance, constantly manage their presentation, and constantly worry about whether their makeup was still perfect or if it had smudged. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from that level of self-monitoring, and it started young. Girls were taught the proper eye makeup techniques as part of their education, learning from their mothers or servants how to apply Kohl, how to achieve the right balance, and how to make their eyes the center of their face. By the time a woman was an adult, these rituals were so ingrained that they probably felt natural, but they were learned. They were constructed. They were maintained through constant repetition and reinforcement. Here's the dark irony. The more perfectly a medieval woman maintained her eye makeup, the less agency she was credited with. If her Kohl was flawless, her eyebrows perfectly plucked, her eyes bright and clear, she was often assumed to be vain, superficial, or obsessed with appearance. The beauty standard that required her to maintain this appearance also judged her for doing so. She couldn't win. If she maintained the standard, she was vain. If she didn't, she was unkempt and low status. It's a double bind that women have been navigating for centuries, and it started here, in the careful application of soot and the painful plucking of hair. Yet despite all of this, the pain, the cost, the toxicity, the psychological burden, women kept doing it. Why? Because the alternative was invisibility. A woman without properly maintained eyes was a woman who could be overlooked, dismissed, or considered unworthy of attention. And in a medieval society where a woman's value was often determined by how desirable she was, invisibility was a kind of death. So women made the calculation, endure the pain, accept the risk, and maintain the appearance. Because being seen, even if it was through the lens of a rigid beauty standard, was better than not being seen at all. And here's the part that echoes into today. We still do this. We still apply makeup to our eyes, still carefully line and define them, still use makeup to create an illusion of larger, brighter, more awake eyes. The tools have changed. We have precision brushes instead of quills, foundation instead of pale powder, eyeshadow palettes instead of crushed minerals. But the basic principle remains the same. We're still taking the most expressive part of our faces and emphasizing it, still making a statement through how we present our eyes, still making calculations about what we're willing to endure for the sake of beauty. Medieval women didn't invent this, but they perfected it, and were still living in the world they created. Alright, so we've covered the eyes. Now let's talk about something that's equally bizarre and somehow even more uncomfortable: medieval teeth. Because while the eyes were the window to the soul, the teeth were the window to your hygiene, your health, and your social status. And medieval people were absolutely obsessed with teeth. Here's the thing that will blow your mind. Medieval people understood dental hygiene better than you might think. They didn't have toothbrushes or toothpaste, as we know them, sure, but they had figured out that clean teeth were important. The problem was that their methods were often as damaging as they were helpful. Picture this. You're a medieval person wanting clean teeth. You can't just pop into a drugstore and buy a tube of Crest. So, what do? You go to a barber surgeon, or you consult a medical manuscript, and here's what you find. According to dental practices from the period, one common tooth cleaning method involved rubbing your teeth with a cloth or soft brush made from animal hair. But what were you cleaning them with? This is where it gets gnarly. Popular tooth cleaning substances included brick dust, charcoal, sage, mint, and occasionally chalk. These would be mixed into pastes or used dry, and you'd scrub your teeth with them. Now, some of these, like charcoal and sage, actually work reasonably well. Charcoal is mildly abrasive and has some mild antibacterial properties. Sage has natural antiseptic qualities. But brick dust, that's literally pulverized brick. It's abrasive enough to remove buildup, sure, but it's also abrasive enough to damage your enamel. Use brick dust regularly, and your teeth would gradually become thinner, more sensitive, and more prone to decay. Contemporary sources suggest that some people used brick dust deliberately, believing that the slight wearing away of the tooth surface was somehow beneficial. It wasn't, but the belief persisted. Other tooth cleaning methods were even more questionable. Some medieval dental practices recommended rubbing your teeth with lemon juice or vinegar. The acid would help remove stains and buildup, which is true, but repeated exposure to acid is terrible for your teeth. Your enamel would gradually dissolve. You'd end up with yellow, sensitive teeth that were actually worse than before you started. But if your teeth were stained and lemon juice made them whiter temporarily, then it worked, right? That's the kind of logic that drove medieval dental care. Quick results mattered more than long-term health. Now, there were some genuinely good practices mixed in with all the terrible ones. Medieval people understood that certain herbs could help with oral health. Mint was widely used for its fresh flavor and mild antiseptic properties. Sage was considered an excellent choice for maintaining healthy gums. Cloves had numbing properties and were used for toothache relief. According to medical texts from the period, a paste made from these herbs, combined with honey and sometimes olive oil, was considered an ideal tooth cleanser. And honestly, this wasn't terrible advice. These herbs do have mild antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. If you used this kind of herbal paste instead of brick dust, your teeth would probably be fine. The problem was that wealthier people often had access to better remedies, while poorer people relied on whatever was cheap and available, which often meant brick dust or chalk. But here's where the real weirdness comes in: the obsession with white teeth. In medieval times, white teeth were a sign of health, youth, and purity. So naturally, people wanted their teeth to be as white as possible. And this is where medieval dental care becomes genuinely alarming. Some beauty manuscripts from the period describe whitening treatments that included ingredients like crushed cuttlebone, pumice, and various herbs. These would be rubbed onto the teeth, which would make them temporarily whiter through abrasion. But the damage would be significant. Your enamel would gradually wear away, your teeth would become sensitive, and eventually they might become discolored permanently. But in the short term, your teeth would look whiter. So people did it. Contemporary sources suggest that wealthy women, especially, would regularly use these whitening treatments, accepting the long-term damage for short-term beauty. Then, there were the truly terrifying whitening methods. Some medieval beauty recipes included urine in the tooth whitening paste. Now, urine does contain urea, which has mild bleaching properties. It actually works, to a degree, but it's also, urine. Some recipes recommend using ammonia-based substances, which are even more effective, but also more damaging. And then there are the recipes that involve lead compounds. I'm talking about actual lead mixed into a tooth whitening paste and rubbed onto your teeth multiple times a day. This would give you a white appearance temporarily, but the lead would gradually accumulate in your body, causing neurological damage, reproductive harm, and eventually poisoning. Medieval physicians didn't fully understand the dangers of lead, but they knew it was toxic. They used it anyway because the whitening effect was dramatic. The truly dark part? Wealthy people knew these whitening methods were damaging, but they used them anyway because having visibly white teeth was such a powerful status symbol that it was worth the risk. If your teeth were white and perfect, you were advertising that you could afford expensive, damaging beauty treatments. You were saying, "I'm wealthy enough to poison myself for the sake of appearance." It's like if today you walked around with a designer accessory that was actively harming you, everyone would know what you were communicating through that choice. You have money, you have status, you're willing to sacrifice your health for the sake of appearance. The calculation was the same in medieval times. Now, let's talk about the other side of tooth aesthetics: the shape and condition of your teeth. In medieval times, teeth were expected to be straight, white, and relatively uniform. But most people don't naturally have perfect teeth. So what did people do? Interestingly, medieval dentistry was more advanced than you might expect. Dental correction wasn't common, but it existed. Some medieval physicians and barber surgeons would attempt to straighten teeth by applying pressure over time. There are historical accounts of devices similar to modern braces bands, made from gold or silver, with tension applied to gradually move teeth into alignment. This was available only to the extremely wealthy, obviously, but the fact that it existed suggests that people understood the basic principles of dental correction centuries before modern orthodontics. For most people, though, dental work meant extraction. If a tooth was damaged, rotted, or causing pain, the solution was to pull it out. Medieval tooth extraction was brutal. There were no anesthetics, no sterile instruments, and infection was a real risk. A barber surgeon might use a tool called a pelican, basically a lever with a padded section that would grip the tooth to extract it. The process was agonizing and often unsuccessful. Teeth would break, roots would remain, and infection would follow. But it was still preferable to living with a painful or rotted tooth. So people endured it. And then they had a gap in their smile. In a medieval society where teeth were a visible marker of health and status, missing teeth were a disaster. They meant you were old or poor or unhealthy or had suffered an injury. They were a permanent advertisement of whatever had gone wrong. This is why tooth health was so important in medieval times. It wasn't just about appearance, though that mattered. It was about maintaining your place in society. If you lost your teeth, you lost a visible marker of your status. And in a world where appearance was everything, that loss was significant. Imagine being a woman who had invested her entire life in maintaining her beauty. The plucked eyebrows, the careful Kohl application, the elaborate clothing, and then you lose a tooth. Suddenly, your carefully constructed appearance is compromised. Every time you smile or speak, people see that gap. That's a kind of catastrophe for someone who had been so careful about managing her appearance. So medieval people were invested in tooth health, not necessarily out of a genuine concern for their well-being, but because they understood what teeth represented. Clean, white, intact teeth meant you were young, healthy, and worth looking at. And being worth looking at was worth enduring pain, accepting risk, and maintaining exhausting daily rituals. Contemporary sources suggest that dental care was a regular part of a medieval woman's morning routine. Right alongside the Kohl and eyebrow plucking, you'd clean your teeth, perhaps with a cloth and an herbal paste. You'd check for damage or decay. You'd maybe rinse with rose water or herbal infusions to freshen your breath. It was maintenance, constant and unending. And here's the thing that really gets at you. Most of this effort was invisible. Your eyes were on display. Everyone could see the Kohl and the plucked brows. But your teeth, people only saw those if you smiled. And in medieval times, smiling was considered somewhat undignified, especially for women. A woman was supposed to maintain a composed expression. A full smile was too revealing, too emotional. So all that effort to maintain your teeth was often invisible. People wouldn't see your perfectly white teeth unless you decided to show them, which means the maintenance of teeth was for you, or for the rare moments when you chose to smile. It was a kind of private vanity, hidden beneath a composed exterior. But here's where it connects to modern times, in a way that's genuinely eerie. We still do this. We still obsess over tooth whiteness, still use treatments that are mildly damaging, still consider perfect teeth a marker of status and wealth. We don't use brick dust anymore, but we do use whitening strips that can damage enamel. We don't apply lead paste, but we do undergo bleaching treatments that can cause sensitivity and permanent damage. We're making the same calculation that medieval women made. Short-term beauty and status are worth long-term health consequences. The methods have changed, but the basic impulse remains the same. We're still poisoning ourselves for the sake of appearance, just with slightly more modern toxins. But we haven't talked about the most important part of medieval dental care: breath. Because here's the thing. White teeth meant nothing if your breath was foul. And in medieval times, before modern plumbing and modern hygiene, breath was a real problem for most people. Let's be honest about medieval society for a second. Most people didn't bathe frequently. They didn't have toothbrushes. They ate a lot of foods that were preserved through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Their diets were heavy on garlic and onions. They didn't brush their teeth or use mouthwash. So, by medieval standards, most people had absolutely terrible breath. And yet, fresh breath was considered essential to beauty. A woman with bad breath, no matter how white her teeth or how perfectly plucked her eyebrows, was considered unattractive. It's like today. You could have perfect skin and perfect makeup, but if you had bad breath, it would ruin the entire effect. So, what did medieval people do about this? According to beauty manuscripts and medical texts from the period, the solution was herbs. Lots and lots of herbs. Women would chew on mint, sage, or cloves to freshen their breath. Some would keep small pouches of dried herbs in their pockets or purses, taking them out to chew before social interactions. This actually worked reasonably well. Mint genuinely does freshen breath. Cloves have aromatic properties. Sage has mild antiseptic qualities. If you chewed these herbs regularly, your breath would probably be fresher than it would be otherwise. But here's where medieval people got creative and slightly unhinged. Some beauty recipes recommended more elaborate, breath-freshening methods. One popular technique involved rinsing your mouth with wine or vinegar infusions. The acidity would help kill bacteria, and the flavor would leave your mouth tasting fresh. Except, as we discussed earlier, repeated acid exposure damages your teeth, so you'd freshen your breath while simultaneously destroying your enamel. That's the medieval beauty standard in a nutshell, solving one problem while creating another. Then there were the more extreme remedies. Some texts recommend eating certain foods to improve breath. Parsley was considered excellent for this purpose, and actually, parsley does help with breath odor because it has natural chlorophyll and antimicrobial properties. Medieval people didn't know the chemistry behind it, but they knew it worked. So wealthy women would make sure parsley was included in their meals, or would chew on parsley leaves after eating. But other recommended foods were less helpful. Some texts suggested eating rose petals, which taste nice but don't actually freshen breath. Some recommended honey, which is sweet but doesn't address bad breath and actually feeds the bacteria in your mouth that cause odor in the first place. And then there were the truly alarming remedies. According to some medieval medical texts, certain breath-freshening methods involved burning aromatic woods or herbs and inhaling the smoke. The idea was that the aromatic smoke would clean out your mouth and lungs, leaving you smelling fresh. Contemporary sources suggest that women would sometimes stand over a bowl of burning herbs, covering their heads with a cloth to trap the smoke, and breathe it in repeatedly. This was supposed to freshen breath and improve overall health. In reality, you're inhaling smoke. That's not good for your lungs. That's not good for your respiratory system. But if it made your breath smell better, temporarily, then it was worth it. Here's where it gets really weird. Some medieval beauty recipes recommend using animal products to freshen breath. One particularly unpleasant remedy involved using a paste made from crushed animal bones, mixed with rose water and herbs. The theory was that the bone material would absorb odors, and the herbs would provide fresh scent. It probably didn't work, but women used it anyway, because the alternative was to have bad breath, and bad breath was a form of failure. It meant you weren't maintaining yourself properly. It meant you didn't care about how you presented to the world. The psychological weight of all this can't be overstated. Medieval women were managing their appearance on multiple levels simultaneously. Eyes needed to be perfect, teeth needed to be white, breath needed to be fresh, hair needed to be covered appropriately, skin needed to be pale, hands needed to be soft. Every single part of the body was subject to scrutiny and required maintenance. And all of this maintenance had to be done in a way that appeared effortless. You were supposed to look beautiful, but you weren't supposed to look like you were trying. You were supposed to maintain an appearance of naturalness while actually spending hours every day on elaborate rituals. It's a kind of performance that requires constant vigilance. And here's the thing about breath specifically. It's not visible. You can't look in a mirror and see if your breath is fresh. You have to rely on others' reactions to know if you're succeeding. So women would have to pay constant attention to social cues, the slight wince, the backward step, the polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Any of these might indicate that your breath was off. So you'd chew more herbs, you'd rinse more carefully, you'd adjust your distance from people when speaking. You'd manage not just your appearance, but people's reactions to you. By the late medieval period, breath freshening had become an elaborate ritual, especially among the wealthy. Some noble households had designated times for breath maintenance. After meals, a woman might excuse herself to rinse her mouth, chew herbs, and freshen up before returning to social interaction. This might sound excessive, but consider the alternative. Spending an entire evening in close proximity to people while your breath gradually deteriorated in a small, enclosed space, and medieval halls and chambers were often quite small. Bad breath would be increasingly noticeable as the evening progressed. So, maintaining fresh breath wasn't vanity, it was a social necessity. There's also an interesting class to mention here. Wealthy women had access to the best herbs, the most effective remedies, and the opportunity to take time for these rituals. Poor women had to make do with what they could find. If you were a peasant woman, you might chew on wild mint, if it were available, or sage from your garden. You probably wouldn't have access to expensive herbs imported from distant regions. So breath quality, like tooth whiteness, became another marker of status. A woman with consistently fresh breath was a woman with access to resources. A woman whose breath sometimes faltered was a woman without those resources. And yet, here's the genuinely fascinating part. Most of the breath-freshening methods that worked were available to anyone. Mint grew wild in many regions. Sage was common in kitchen gardens. Cloves were more expensive, but other aromatic herbs could substitute. So theoretically, poor women could maintain fresh breath too. But in practice, maintaining constant freshness required time and attention that poor women probably didn't have. They were working all day. They didn't have time to chew herbs between tasks. They didn't have the luxury of excusing themselves to freshen up before social interaction. So, even the most effective remedies were effectively available only to women who had the time and status to use them properly. This created an interesting hierarchy of breath freshness in medieval society. The wealthiest women, with access to the best herbs and the time to use them regularly, would have the freshest breath. Middle-class women would manage it reasonably well, maintaining freshness most of the time, but occasionally faltering. Poor women would have fresher breath than you might expect. Herbs were available, and they did work, but less consistently. and men. Interestingly, bad breath seems to have been more tolerated in men than in women. A man with bad breath might be considered rough or uncivilized, but it wouldn't damage his reputation the way it would for a woman. This is where gender and appearance intersect in really telling ways. Women's bodies were supposed to be perpetually fresh, perpetually pleasant, and perpetually available for others' consumption. Men had more flexibility. The legacy of this obsession with fresh breath echoes into today in ways we don't always notice. Modern culture is still intensely focused on breath freshness. We have mouthwash, breath mints, tongue scrapers, and an entire industry built around the fear of bad breath. We're still making the calculation that medieval women made. Maintaining constant freshness is worth the time and effort. We're still chewing mint gum, still rinsing with mouthwash, still managing our breath before social interaction. The methods have changed, but the basic impulse, the anxiety about being judged for something as fundamental as how we smell, that remains the same. And here's the part that really stings. It's still gendered. Women are still expected to maintain fresher breath, to smell better, to be more pleasant smelling than men are. A woman with bad breath is considered unhygienic or unattractive. A man with bad breath is just a guy who doesn't take great care of himself. The double standard persists. We've gone centuries, changed almost everything about how we live, and yet we still carry this medieval anxiety about women's bodies needing to be perpetually fresh and pleasant. Medieval women didn't invent this, but they certainly perfected it, and we're still living in the world they created, still chewing mint gum, still worrying about how we smell, still making these subtle calculations about what we're willing to do to be considered acceptable. All right, so we've covered eyes and teeth. Now, let's talk about something that seems like it should be straightforward, but becomes absolutely bizarre once you understand what was actually happening: bathing and fragrance. Because medieval people had a genuinely complicated relationship with water, and the way they approached cleanliness was nothing like what we do today. Here's what will blow your mind. Medieval people bathed much more than popular culture suggests. The stereotype is that medieval people were filthy and never bathed. That's not entirely accurate. What's actually true is more nuanced and way more interesting. Medieval people bathed regularly, but their reasons for bathing had almost nothing to do with hygiene. Bathing was considered therapeutic, medicinal, and yes, occasionally cleansing. But the primary purpose was different than you might expect. Picture this. You're a wealthy woman in 14th century England or France. You want to bathe. What does that involve? First, you need water. Lots of it. Heating water is labor-intensive and expensive. So if you're bathing, you're probably wealthy. Servants would spend hours hauling water and heating it over fires. The water would be heated in large pots or kettles and then poured into a wooden tub, literally a large wooden barrel cut in half. You'd get in and you'd soak. But here's where it gets interesting. The water would often be mixed with herbs, flowers, and sometimes fragrances. According to contemporary sources, a medieval bath wasn't just hot water. It was a carefully constructed experience. Rose petals might be scattered on the surface of the water. Lavender might be added for its supposed therapeutic properties. Herbs like chamomile or sage might be infused into the water. Sometimes, more elaborate preparations were used. Rose water might be added, or the water might be mixed with milk or wine. The purpose wasn't to clean your skin, it was to perfume it, to treat it, to improve your complexion. The bathing process was less about hygiene and more about beauty and wellness. This is important to understand. In medieval times, water itself was considered slightly dangerous. The theory, based on medieval medical understanding, was that water could open your pores and let disease in. So, repeatedly, bathing in plain water was seen as risky. But bathing in herbal water? That was medicinal. The herbs were thought to protect you while you bathed. This is why baths were so elaborate and why they included so many added ingredients. The water needed to be transformed, made medicinal, and made safe. Contemporary medical texts describe baths as important therapeutic treatments, prescribed by physicians for various ailments. So here's the calculation. You'd bathe not to get clean necessarily, but because a physician recommended it, or because you wanted to improve your complexion, or because you wanted to perfume your skin. You'd soak in herbal water for an hour or more. Your skin would become soft and slightly fragrant, and then you'd emerge feeling refreshed, which was the real point. The psychological and emotional benefits of a warm bath were enormous, especially in a world without central heating, where most buildings were cold and damp for most of the year. A bath was a luxury, a treat, a moment of comfort in an otherwise uncomfortable life. But here's where the concept gets more complicated. Bathing was also public in many medieval communities. In larger towns and cities, there were public baths, bathhouses, where people could go to bathe for a fee. These were important social spaces. Men and women bathed separately, usually in different times or in different areas. People would soak in large communal tubs, sometimes in herbal water, sometimes in plain water. The bathhouses were places where you could relax, socialize, and yes, bathe. They were also, it should be noted, places where sexually transmitted diseases spread quite easily. Medieval authorities were constantly trying to regulate bathhouses because they had a reputation for being not just cleaning facilities, but also places of loose morality and disease. Now, there's an interesting development in the late medieval period that changed how medieval people thought about bathing, the hammam, or Turkish bath. As trade connections with the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire increased, knowledge of hammam culture spread to Western Europe. A hammam is a steam bath. You'd sit in a heated room, sweat profusely, and then get cleaned by attendants who would scrub your skin with rough cloths. Theoretically, this was more hygienic than soaking in a tub. You'd actually get clean rather than just perfumed. And in some wealthy European centers, particularly Venice and other trading cities, hammams were constructed and became fashionable. But here's the thing about hammams that's relevant to our discussion. They became associated with exotic luxury and, honestly, with sensuality. The idea of a semi-naked person being scrubbed and cleaned by attendants in a steamy room had obvious erotic associations. So bathhouses that offered hammam-style bathing attracted wealthy people who wanted the experience of exotic luxury, but they also attracted less savory reputations. Conservative authorities worried about the moral implications of hammams. What was actually happening in those steamy rooms? The suspicion was enough to make hammams controversial in many European cities. For most people, though, bathing was less elaborate. A peasant woman might wash in a river during warm months. She might take a basin of water and wash her face, and hands daily cleanliness of the hands and face was considered important. But full body bathing was a luxury. Most people probably bathed a few times a year at most, often in connection with holidays or festivals or religious observances. Christmas and Easter were traditional bathing times. Before a wedding, a woman would bathe. Before giving birth, if possible, a woman might bathe. These were significant occasions, marked by ritual cleansing. The bathing was ceremonial, not routine. And here's the thing that ties it all together: the smell. Medieval people were acutely aware of smell, and they understood that the body produced odors that bathing could temporarily address. So bathing became tied to preparation. You bathed before important events because you wanted to smell fresh and clean. Contemporary sources describe the process. A woman would bathe, then immediately put on clean clothes, often spraying them with fragrance or perfume. She wouldn't linger in the air after bathing because she didn't want to lose the scent of cleanliness and fragrance. You were racing against time, trying to maintain that fresh state for as long as possible before your body's natural odors returned. This brings us to fragrance, and this is where medieval beauty culture becomes genuinely sophisticated. Because if bathing was occasional, then fragrance was essential for maintaining the illusion of cleanliness and freshness. And medieval people were absolutely obsessed with fragrance. Picture a wealthy woman in her chamber. On her table sits an array of fragrance sources: rose water, lavender water, perfumed oils, dried flowers, and herbs. These were expensive. A bottle of imported rose water could cost as much as a day's wages for a laborer. But for a woman trying to maintain her appearance and status, fragrance was essential. You'd apply fragrance multiple times a day. You'd dab it on your wrists, behind your ears, on your neck. You'd spray it on your clothes. You'd scent your hair. You'd perfume your hands. Contemporary sources suggest that a noblewoman might go through a bottle of rose water in a matter of weeks. According to historical records from the period, some of the most popular fragrances were rose, lavender, violet, and musk. Rose and lavender were plant-based and relatively accessible if you had access to trade networks. Violet was less common, but still available. Musk, though musk was the premium fragrance, was the thing that advertised your wealth most clearly. Musk comes from an animal gland, typically from a musk deer or musk rat. It had to be imported from Asia, which made it extraordinarily expensive. A small amount of musk, literally a few grams, could cost more than a servant made in a year. But the scent was distinctive, intense, and absolutely unmistakable. If you wore musk, everyone knew you were wealthy. Now here's where it gets interesting. Perfumes weren't just fragrance. They were also thought to have medicinal properties. Rose water was believed to improve mood and calm anxiety. Lavender was thought to aid sleep and reduce stress. Violet was considered cooling and soothing. So applying fragrance wasn't just about smelling good. It was about self-medication. You were treating yourself with these scented products, addressing emotional and physical issues through smell. Contemporary medical texts discuss the therapeutic properties of different fragrances. A physician might recommend that a patient wear rose water to improve her temperament, or lavender to help her sleep. The fragrance was medicine, but the reality was that most of these medicinal properties were either placebo or marginally real at best. What actually mattered was the psychological effect of fragrance. A woman who smelled good felt good. She felt confident, attractive, and well cared for. That psychological boost was real and significant, and in a society where appearance was everything, that psychological boost translated into real social benefits. A woman who smelled good and felt confident about her smell would carry herself differently. She'd be more likely to make eye contact, to speak with more authority, to take up space. The fragrance wasn't just superficial, it was functional. The production of fragrance was also an elaborate process that reflected class differences. Wealthy women had access to imported fragrances created by specialists, perfumers in Venice, Paris, and other wealthy cities were respected artisans. They experimented with different plant materials, different extraction methods, and different combinations. Some of their recipes are still preserved in historical documents. They were creating complex, nuanced fragrances that layered different scents. But most women didn't have access to these elaborate creations. They had to make do with simpler fragrances. Rose water made at home by soaking rose petals in water, lavender water made from dried lavender, or scented oils made by infusing herbs into animal fat. The production of these homemade fragrances was time-consuming, but not difficult. A woman with access to an herb garden or dried herbs could make a serviceable fragrance. So, while wealthy women had access to the best fragrances, even poorer women could have some scent, which meant fragrance became another marker of status and taste. What fragrance you wore, how often you wore it, and the quality of the fragrance all communicated information about your wealth and social position. A poor woman smelling faintly of homemade rose water was different from a noble woman wearing imported musk. Everyone could smell the difference, and everyone understood what that difference meant. But here's where the fragrance story gets darker and more complicated, because while fragrance was considered beautiful and desirable, there was also a deep anxiety about what fragrance was actually concealing. In medieval times, smell was directly associated with morality and health. A good smell meant you were virtuous and healthy. A bad smell meant you were sick, sinful, or morally corrupt. This created an interesting paradox. If you smelled too good, if you wore too much fragrance, you might be suspected of trying to hide something. You might be suspected of loose morality. According to contemporary sermons and medical texts, excessive fragrance was sometimes associated with seduction and sexual immorality. A woman who smelled too good, who wore too much perfume, who made her fragrance obvious she was potentially a woman of questionable virtue. This was especially true of musk. Musk was associated with sensuality, with the body, with things that were slightly disreputable. Some conservative religious authorities preached against the use of musk as immoral and tempting, and yet wealthy women wore it anyway, because the benefits of smelling good, of signaling wealth and status, outweighed the risk of being suspected of immorality. But it was a constant calculation. You had to smell good enough to attract positive attention, but not so good that you attracted the wrong kind of attention. This tension played out particularly in religious contexts. Convents and monasteries had complex rules about fragrance. Some convents forbade any perfume or fragrance as a form of mortification. You were supposed to accept your body's natural smell as part of accepting your mortal nature. Other convents allowed fragrance, but only certain kinds. Floral fragrances like rose were acceptable because they were associated with purity. and the Virgin Mary, but animal fragrances like musk were forbidden as too sensual, too tempting. Nuns were supposed to smell like flowers, not like animals. This distinction reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward fragrance. They understood that different smells carried different meanings. A rose smell meant purity. A musk smell meant sensuality. Your fragrance was a form of communication, and you had to choose carefully what you were communicating. Now, let's talk about the actual chemistry of fragrance production, because this is where medieval people demonstrated some genuinely impressive knowledge. Contemporary perfumers understood extraction methods that wouldn't be rediscovered or formalized until centuries later. They knew how to create infusions by steeping plant material in alcohol or oil. They understood that different plants required different extraction methods. Rose petals, for example, needed to be processed carefully to preserve the scent. Some perfumers used a process called enfleurage, where petals were placed on layers of fat and left for extended periods. The fat would absorb the scent, creating a fragrant paste that could then be mixed with other ingredients. This is actually the same basic method used in modern natural perfumery. Medieval perfumers also experimented with combinations. They'd mix rose with lavender or violet with rose, creating layered fragrances that were more complex than single-note scents. Some of the most sophisticated fragrances included anise, clove, or other spices. According to historical records, a wealthy perfumer in Venice or Paris might have a stockpile of dozens of different plant and animal materials, and they'd experiment endlessly with different combinations. The results were impressive. Some of the fragrance recipes that survived from the medieval period smell remarkably good, even by modern standards. But here's the thing about medieval fragrance production. It was also heavily adulterated. Because high-quality fragrance was expensive and in high demand, there was an incentive to stretch it further. A perfumer might create a base fragrance using quality ingredients, then dilute it with cheaper materials, or add synthetic smells to make it stronger. According to contemporary sources, some perfumers added unpleasant materials to their fragrances just to make them smell stronger. Materials as musk paste mixed with animal droppings, or ingredients that were toxic and unpleasant in high concentrations. The goal was to create something that smelled impressive without actually costing that much to produce. This is where medieval fragrance started to become dangerous. Some fragrance recipes from the period included ingredients that are now known to be harmful. Certain recipes recommended using arsenic or lead compounds in fragrances, supposedly to make them more vivid or long-lasting. Wearing arsenic-containing fragrance on your skin repeatedly, day after day, would result in gradual poisoning. Your hands would absorb the arsenic. You'd absorb it through your skin every time you touched your fragrance-sprayed clothes. Wealthy women who wore these fragrances would be slowly accumulating toxins in their bodies. They might not realize they were being poisoned. The symptoms would be gradual and vague, like fatigue or nausea or digestive issues. They might attribute these symptoms to other causes, but the fragrance itself was slowly harming them. Contemporary sources suggest that some medieval women were aware of this risk, but didn't care. The fragrance was expensive, it smelled incredible, and it advertised their status. If there was a health cost, that was a problem for later. This is the same calculation that drove the eye makeup and the teeth, whitening beauty and status, were worth the risk of poisoning yourself. The difference is that, with fragrance, the poisoning was slower and less obvious. You'd gradually get sicker, but you might never realize why. Interestingly, there was also a class dimension to fragrance poisoning. Wealthy women wearing expensive, adulterated fragrances full of lead or arsenic were being poisoned, but poorer women wearing homemade rose water or lavender water, those fragrances were relatively safe. So ironically, the most expensive, most status signaling fragrances were actually the most dangerous. A poor woman with cheap, homemade fragrance might be healthier than a rich woman with imported, adulterated fragrance, but the rich woman looked better and smelled more impressive, so she was still winning in the social calculus. By the late medieval period, fragrance had become so important that some cities had fragrance guilds. Perfumers were licensed and regulated, but regulation was minimal. Mostly, it was about maintaining prices and preventing too much competition. There was less emphasis on safety or quality than on protecting the profit margins of established perfumers. So the adulteration and the poisoning continued. Here's the thing that really gets you when you think about it. Medieval women understood that fragrance was important, that it communicated status and beauty. They were willing to spend enormous amounts of money on it. They were willing to endure the smell of some truly unpleasant ingredients mixed into their fragrances. They were willing to risk their health for it. And they did all of this because fragrance was an invisible power. It preceded you into a room. It lingered after you left. It was the most intimate thing about your appearance, the thing that affected people's emotions and perceptions in ways they couldn't quite explain. A woman who smelled good had power that went beyond her visual appearance. She had gotten into people's minds through their sense of smell. And here's the part that echoes into today in a genuinely uncanny way. We still do this. We still spend enormous amounts of money on fragrances. We still wear fragrances that might contain toxic ingredients. We still use fragrance as a way of communicating status and identity. We still understand fragrance as power. Some of the most expensive fragrances today contain synthetic musk compounds that have known health risks. Some contain ingredients that bioaccumulate in your body, but we wear them anyway because fragrance is status, because fragrance is seduction, because fragrance is power. We've just rebranded it with different names and different packaging. The basic impulse to smell good enough to matter, to use fragrance as a tool of social control and status signaling that hasn't changed since medieval times. We're still doing what medieval women figured out, that how you smell matters more than you'd think, and people will endure significant risks to smell a particular way. All right, so we've covered the eyes, the teeth, and fragrance. Now, let's dive into what might be the most fascinating and disturbing part of medieval beauty, the actual recipes. Because medieval women weren't just using manufactured cosmetics made by professionals. They were creating their own beauty products at home, and some of these recipes were genuinely ingenious. Others were catastrophically dangerous. Let's start with something that seems innocent enough. Egg white. According to beauty manuscripts from the period, one of the most popular face treatments involved egg white. Here's how it worked. You'd separate the white from the yolk, whip it slightly, and then apply it to your face. As it dried, it would tighten your skin, creating a smooth, taut appearance. Contemporary sources describe women sitting perfectly still for hours while egg white dried on their faces, creating a kind of temporary lifting effect. Once it dried completely, they'd rinse it off, and their skin would look temporarily smoother and tighter. The effect was temporary. It would last a few hours. But for important events, it was worth it. The genius of egg white is that it actually works. Egg white contains proteins that do tighten skin. If you apply it to your face and let it dry, your skin will look smoother and more lifted. Modern skincare still uses egg white for this reason. So, medieval women had figured out an effective facial treatment without any of the toxic ingredients. But of course, medieval women didn't stop there. They had to complicate things. Some recipes recommend mixing egg white with other ingredients to enhance the effect. Rose water might be added to make it smell better. Honey might be added to make it smoother and to add supposed healing properties. Some recipes got really elaborate, mixing egg white with crushed pearls or other expensive ingredients. The pearl would theoretically increase the lifting effect and also advertise the wealth of the woman using it. Pearls were expensive, so including them in your face mask was showing off. According to contemporary sources, some wealthy women would use recipes that included finely ground precious stones mixed into egg white. The stones wouldn't actually do anything, but they looked impressive and they communicated wealth. But here's where medieval cosmetics took a turn toward the genuinely alarming, because while egg white was safe, other face treatments were not. Let me introduce you to something called ceruse, which was the white face makeup of choice for medieval and Renaissance women. Ceruse was basically lead. Specifically, it was lead carbonate ground into a fine powder and mixed with vinegar or other liquids to create a thick paste that could be applied to the face. And yes, I'm talking about lead, the same lead that we now know causes neurological damage, reproductive harm, and poisoning. Medieval women were painting it on their faces repeatedly for years or decades. Here's how it worked. You'd apply the ceruse paste to your face, covering your entire visible skin. You'd let it dry, creating a thick white mask. The effect was striking. Your face would be completely white, creating a dramatic contrast with your dark, kohl-lined eyes. It was the height of fashion for wealthy women in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially. According to contemporary sources, women would apply ceruse daily, sometimes multiple times a day. They'd reapply it if it started to crack or flake. Over the years, a woman would apply ceruse hundreds of times, absorbing lead through her skin and through inhalation of the dust. The medical consequences were severe. Lead accumulates in the body. Repeated exposure causes neurological damage, anemia, reproductive problems, and eventually poisoning. Contemporary medical texts from the period actually mention that some women experienced problems from ceruse use. They mention hair loss, skin damage, and various health issues. But the texts don't explicitly connect these problems to lead poisoning, because the understanding of toxicology wasn't sophisticated enough. What they do mention is that ceruse was associated with aging rapidly. Women who used ceruse heavily would often develop severely damaged skin, thinning, scarring, and excessive wrinkling. The very substance meant to make them look beautiful and youthful was actually aging them prematurely and poisoning them. And here's the truly dark part. Women knew about these risks. Contemporary sources suggest that some women were aware that ceruse could damage skin, but they used it anyway. Why? Because the beauty standard demanded it. A pale white face was so desirable, so essential to being considered beautiful, that the long-term health consequences didn't matter. Or rather, they mattered less than the immediate social consequences of not being beautiful. A woman without ceruse would be considered dark, sallow, and unhealthy looking. Her social status would suffer. So, she'd apply the ceruse, accepting the damage to her skin and her health in exchange for immediate beauty and status. Now, ceruse wasn't the only dangerous white face makeup. Some recipes used other lead compounds. Others used mercury compounds, which are even more toxic than lead. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, neurological damage, and psychological problems. Repeated exposure to mercury can cause permanent brain damage. And yet, some medieval and Renaissance women used mercury-containing cosmetics. According to historical records, some women developed symptoms of mercury poisoning tremors, mood changes, and memory problems, and attributed them to other causes or accepted them as a cost of beauty. But wait, there's more. Some face whitening recipes used arsenic compounds. Yes, arsenic, the poison used in murders and executions, mixed into a paste and applied to the face repeatedly. According to historical sources, some women who used arsenic-containing face treatments experienced severe health problems, nausea, vomiting, digestive issues, and skin damage. But because the poisoning was gradual, they might not have realized what was causing the problems. They might have assumed it was just part of aging or part of the general wear and tear of life. So here's the situation medieval women faced. If you wanted to be considered beautiful, if you wanted to maintain your status, if you wanted to attract a good marriage, or maintain your position in society, you had to paint your face with toxic substances. There was no way around it. You could use less harmful substances. Some women did use chalk or other minerals instead of lead or mercury. But those alternatives were less effective, less dramatic, less fashionable. So wealthy women, the women with the most to lose by being considered unattractive, were the most likely to use the most dangerous substances. They were slowly poisoning themselves for the sake of beauty. According to contemporary sources, some women tried to minimize the damage by applying protective layers under the ceruse, mixing ceruse with oils or fats to create a barrier between the poison and their skin. Did this actually help? Probably not significantly. Lead and mercury penetrate skin regardless of whether there's a barrier. But the fact that women were trying to protect themselves suggests they understood, on some level, that what they were doing was dangerous. They were trying to have it both ways to be beautiful without poisoning themselves. But it doesn't really work that way. With toxins, the psychological toll of this can't be overstated. Imagine being a woman, knowing that the standard of beauty requires you to paint poison on your face. Imagine applying it every morning, feeling the weight of it, knowing what it is, and doing it anyway. Imagine the anxiety about what this repeated poisoning might be doing to your body. Some women probably experience this as a kind of bodily autonomy violation. They were being forced to poison themselves by the social demand for beauty. The choice wasn't really a choice. It was comply with the standard or be ostracized. Those are the only two options. And here's where it gets really dark. Some of the most elite women, the women with the most to prove, probably used the most dangerous formulations, because if you wanted to advertise your wealth and status, you'd use the most expensive, most exotic, most dangerous ingredients. You'd use pure lead or pure mercury. You'd use the most extreme version of the trend. And so the women with the most resources were the ones most likely to poison themselves most severely. The irony is almost too much to bear. Contemporary sources from the Renaissance and early modern period actually document women's awareness of these dangers. Some wrote in their journals or letters about the damage ceruse was doing to their skin. Some expressed anxiety about the health effects, but they kept using it because the alternative to stop using it, to let your face return to its natural color, was unthinkable. That would mean admitting defeat. That would mean accepting that you were no longer beautiful, no longer worth looking at, and for women whose entire social value was tied to their appearance, that was worse than poisoning yourself. This is where medieval beauty culture becomes genuinely tragic, because it wasn't just about vanity or shallow concern with appearance. It was about survival. A beautiful woman had options. She could make a good marriage, secure her future, and possibly gain some power and influence. An ugly woman had very few options. So women calculated, is it worth poisoning myself to secure my future? And many women decided yes. Yes, it was worth it. The cost was their health. The benefit was their survival. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. But medieval and Renaissance women made it repeatedly. But let's step back for a moment and talk about the recipes that weren't actively poisonous. Because, alongside all the lead and mercury, medieval women were also creating genuinely clever cosmetic treatments using herbs and natural ingredients. These recipes reveal a sophisticated understanding of botany, extraction, and skin chemistry. One popular recipe for improving skin involved rose water mixed with honey and various herbs. The rose water would provide moisture and fragrance. The honey would add a sticky texture and supposed healing properties. Then herbs like lavender, chamomile, or calendula might be added. Contemporary beauty manuscripts describe this mixture being applied as a kind of mask, left on for an hour or more, and then rinsed off. The result would be softer, more hydrated skin. And actually, this would work. Rose water is hydrating. Honey has some mild antibacterial and moisturizing properties, and chamomile has anti-inflammatory effects. Medieval women had figured out a decent skincare treatment. But of course, medieval cosmetics weren't satisfied with something that merely worked. They had to make it more elaborate. Some recipes recommend adding crushed pearls to the honey rose water mixture. Others suggested adding rose petals themselves or dried lavender flowers. Some recipes got truly baroque, mixing in almond oil, goat's milk, and other expensive ingredients. The more expensive and elaborate the recipe, the more impressive it was. Using a beauty treatment that included crushed pearls and imported rose water was essentially displaying your wealth on your face. Then, there were the recipes for removing unwanted marks or blemishes. According to contemporary beauty manuscripts, if you had spots or marks on your skin, various treatments were recommended. One involved mixing lemon juice with honey and applying it to the spot. Another involved using a paste made from turmeric and milk. Some recipes recommend using crushed pumice stone mixed with oil. Contemporary sources suggest that these treatments were partially effective. Some of them probably did help fade marks over time, while others were probably just a waste of time. But the important thing is, that medieval women were trying. They understood that skin conditions could be treated, and they were experimenting with different approaches. Some of the most interesting recipes involved using materials that seem bizarre now, but actually made a lot of sense given medieval understanding of the body. For example, one popular treatment for improving skin involved using a paste made from crushed snail shells mixed with rose water. The theory was that the snails had something to do with moisture and regeneration, so crushing them and applying them to the skin would improve skin quality. Obviously, this didn't work, but it's the kind of reasoning that made sense given the limited understanding of biology at the time. Medieval people were making intuitive leaps based on observation and metaphor. Another category of homemade cosmetic recipes involved hair treatments. Because while we've talked about the eyes and the skin, hair was equally important to medieval beauty standards. According to contemporary sources, women spent enormous amounts of time and resources maintaining their hair, and the recipes for hair care were elaborate. One popular hair treatment involved using oils almond oil, rose oil, or other fragrant oils. These would be massaged into the scalp and hair, left for hours or overnight, then rinsed out. The effect would be softer, shinier hair. Contemporary beauty manuscripts describe this as a regular treatment, something done weekly or even more frequently for wealthy women. The oils would moisturize the hair and scalp, which actually does improve hair quality. So this was a genuinely effective treatment. But there were also more questionable hair treatments. Some recipes recommend using ash mixed with water to create a caustic solution, which would supposedly lighten hair. The theory was that the ash would bleach the hair. In reality, this would probably just damage it. A caustic solution applied to hair repeatedly would weaken the hair shaft, causing breakage and damage. But if it temporarily lightened the hair, if it created the illusion of lighter, sun-bleached hair, then it was worth it. According to contemporary sources, lighter hair was often considered more beautiful, so women would subject their hair to these damaging treatments to achieve it. Then there were the recipes for hair removal, because just as eyebrows needed to be removed, other body hair needed to be dealt with. According to beauty manuscripts, one popular method involved making a paste from a walnut oil and quicklime. The quicklime is calcium oxide, which is highly caustic. Applied to the skin, it would burn away hair. It would also burn away skin. But if you got the concentration right, if you applied it carefully and washed it off quickly, you could remove hair without causing permanent damage. Probably. Contemporary sources suggest that women used this method despite the obvious risks. Unwanted body hair was considered unsightly, and removing it was considered essential to beauty. Another hair removal method involved using a mixture of vinegar, honey, and various herbs. This was less caustic than the quicklime method, and probably more pleasant to use, but also probably less effective. Contemporary beauty manuscripts describe women choosing between the more effective but more dangerous methods and the less effective but safer methods. And interestingly, the choice often depended on circumstances. For a major event where appearance was critical, you might use the dangerous quicklime method. For regular maintenance, you'd use the gentler vinegar-based method. Women were making risk calculations, deciding when the risk was worth it and when it wasn't. Now, here's where I need to introduce something genuinely important. The recipes themselves reveal something about medieval women's agency and knowledge. These recipes were written down, copied, passed from woman to woman, and preserved in manuscripts. They represent a kind of women's knowledge, practical, embodied, experiential. Women who couldn't read or write might still memorize recipes, pass them on verbally. Women who could read and write might carefully copy recipes into personal manuscripts, creating their own collections of beauty treatments. This was a way of preserving knowledge, of creating a kind of women's science that operated outside of official medical or academic channels. According to historical records, some of the most detailed and sophisticated cosmetic recipe collections came from women in wealthy households. A noblewoman might spend years collecting recipes, experimenting with them, and perfecting them. She'd create her own version of a beauty manuscript, customizing recipes based on what worked for her, what she could afford, and what ingredients were available to her. This manuscript might be consulted by her daughters, by other women in her household, by her female relatives. It was a form of knowledge transmission, a way of passing practical information and wisdom from one generation to the next. Some of these manuscripts were so detailed and sophisticated that they rival modern skincare guides in terms of their systematic approach. A woman might have a basic routine cleansing with rose water, applying a nourishing oil, and then specialized treatments for specific problems or seasons. In winter, when skin was dry, she might use heavier oils and more moisturizing masks. In summer, when skin was oily, she might use lighter treatments or treatments with more astringent ingredients like lemon juice. She was adjusting her routine based on environmental factors and individual skin needs. That's actually pretty sophisticated skincare thinking. But here's the tragic part. All of this knowledge, all of this experimentation, all of this practical wisdom was driven by an impossible beauty standard. Women were developing all this expertise, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because beauty was survival. Because maintaining your appearance was the only way to maintain your status and security. So even the genuinely clever, genuinely effective recipes were ultimately in service of an oppressive system. And here's where we connect back to the poisonous recipes. Because some women, trying to achieve the most dramatic results, moved from herbal recipes to chemical recipes. They moved from honey and rose water to lead and mercury. The logic was, if the herbal recipe works a little bit, then the chemical recipe will work a lot more. If rose water moisturizes skin, then lead ceruse will make skin dramatically white and beautiful. The escalation from safe to dangerous wasn't accidental. It was a direct result of the beauty standard demanding more and more extreme results. Contemporary sources suggest that some women were aware of the danger, but felt trapped. They knew that ceruse was dangerous. They'd see other women experiencing health problems from it. But they also knew that if they didn't use it, they'd be considered ugly and low status. So they used it anyway, managing the risk as best they could, trying to minimize the damage while still achieving the desired look. It's a genuinely tragic situation. Women are aware of the harm, but unable to escape the system that demands the harm. By the late medieval period, some medical authorities began warning against the most dangerous cosmetics. There are actual medical texts from the period that warn women against using ceruse or mercury-containing cosmetics. But these warnings were largely ignored or dismissed, because what was a woman supposed to do? stop using ceruse and accept being considered ugly, that wasn't really an option. So women read the warnings, understood the risks, and used the dangerous cosmetics anyway. They were making an informed choice to poison themselves, which is its own kind of tragedy. The legacy of this persists today in ways we don't always notice. We still have beauty standards that push people to use potentially harmful products. We still have women using bleaching creams containing mercury in some parts of the world. We still have people undergoing procedures and using products that carry health risks. The calculus hasn't changed. Beauty and status are still worth some level of health risk for many people. We've just gotten better at minimizing the most obvious dangers while introducing new ones. We use sunscreen that some studies suggest might contain harmful chemicals. We use hair dyes that are under investigation for health risks. We do cosmetic procedures with lasting health consequences. The basic impulse that appearance is worth sacrifice remains exactly the same as it was in medieval times. All right, so we've talked about faces and cosmetics. Now let's shift our focus downward and talk about the body itself, because medieval beauty standards weren't just about the face. They were intensely focused on body shape, on how you carried yourself, on how your clothing revealed or concealed your body, and the methods medieval women used to achieve the right body shape were no less extreme than the facial treatments we've already discussed. Let me start with something that seems straightforward, but becomes genuinely complicated. What was considered beautiful in terms of body shape? The answer: it depended on the time period and region. But generally, medieval and Renaissance beauty ideals favored a very specific silhouette. The ideal woman had a small, high chest, a tiny waist, and either a slightly rounded belly or full hips. This created a silhouette that was dramatically curved, not the flat, athletic ideal of modern times, but something much more exaggerated and feminine. Picture this: you're a medieval woman trying to achieve this silhouette. Your natural body doesn't cooperate. So what do? You use garments designed to reshape your body. The most important of these was the girdle. Now, before you think of a girdle as the elastic waistband thing your grandmother might wear, understand that medieval girdles were something very different. A medieval girdle was a garment worn directly under your outer clothing, and it was designed to dramatically compress and reshape your torso. According to contemporary sources, a medieval girdle was typically made from linen or wool, sometimes reinforced with wooden or bone stays. It would be wrapped tightly around your torso, starting just below your chest and extending down to your hips. Contemporary descriptions suggest that these girdles were extremely tight. They would compress your ribcage, your waist, and your stomach. The effect would be dramatic. Your waist would appear tiny, your chest would be pushed up, creating a very pronounced silhouette. Contemporary sources describe women's waists being compressed to unnaturally small sizes. Some accounts suggest that the tightest girdles reduced waist measurements by several inches. Now, the obvious question: how tight is too tight? And the answer is, medieval women didn't always know or care. Contemporary sources describe women experiencing difficulty breathing while wearing their girdles. Some accounts mention dizziness, fainting, and difficulty moving. But the beauty standard demanded it, so women wore them anyway. And importantly, the tighter the girdle, the more status it advertised. A woman wearing a girdle so tight she could barely breathe was advertising that she didn't need to do physical labor. She had servants. She didn't need to move freely or comfortably. Her extreme discomfort was a status symbol. But here's where it gets really dark. Wearing an extremely tight girdle for years or decades had actual physical consequences. Your ribcage could be permanently deformed. Your internal organs could be compressed and damaged. Women who wore tight girdles their entire lives might experience chronic health problems, difficulty breathing, digestive issues, back pain. Some accounts suggest that some women developed actual skeletal deformities from years of tight girdle wearing. Their rib cages would permanently reshape, becoming compressed and distorted. They'd grown up wearing girdles. Their bodies had adapted to them, and as adults, they couldn't remove them without intense discomfort. According to historical records, some women were literally unable to function without their girdles. They'd grown so accustomed to the compression, so dependent on the support, that without the girdle, they felt unstable and in pain. It's a kind of physical dependence, similar to modern tight-lacing corsets. The garment was meant to reshape the body temporarily, but with repeated use over years, the body actually reshaped itself. The temporary became permanent, and once that happened, a woman was trapped. She had to wear the girdle to be comfortable, but wearing it was slowly damaging her body. It's a genuinely tragic cycle, but girdles weren't the only method of body reshaping. There was also lacing, the precursor to what would later become corset lacing. According to contemporary sources, by the late medieval period, some garments were designed with lacing systems that would allow for tightening. A woman would wear a girdle or a fitted gown that had laces running up the back or sides. Throughout the day, the laces could be tightened to increase compression. Contemporary accounts describe women asking servants to tighten their laces throughout the day, creating a gradually increasing level of compression. By the end of the day, a woman might be far more tightly laced than she was in the morning. The effect of this repeated, increasing compression would be significant. Your body would gradually adapt to the pressure. Your ribs would shift. Your organs would be pushed around. You'd become weaker in your core muscles because the garment was doing the work of holding you up. If you suddenly removed the compression, you'd feel unstable and in pain. So, women continued the practice, tightening their laces throughout the day, going to bed in their partially laced garments, waking up to tighten them again. It became a constant practice, something that happened automatically, and something that women barely thought about, even though it was slowly reshaping their bodies. Contemporary sources describe the psychological aspects of this as well. A woman wearing a tight girdle or heavily laced garment would be constantly aware of her body, constantly aware of her compression, constantly aware of her restriction. She couldn't forget that her body was being controlled and reshaped. Every breath she took had to be conscious and deliberate. Every movement had to be calculated. She had to be careful how she ate. Eating too much while wearing a tight girdle would cause pain or could make her sick. She had to be careful how she sat. Sitting incorrectly would cause discomfort or could damage the stays. Even sleeping would be difficult. You can't truly relax when your torso is being compressed. And here's the thing that really gets at you. Girls were started in these garments young. Contemporary sources describe children being put into girdles or stays as soon as they were old enough to be properly dressed. A girl might spend her entire life from ages 5 or 6 onward in these compression garments. Her body would never develop naturally. Her rib cage would grow compressed from the start. By adulthood, her normal body shape would already be distorted. She wouldn't remember what it felt like to breathe freely or move without restriction. That would be her normal. Some medieval medical authorities warned against overly tight girdles, especially for young girls whose bodies were still developing. They understood that the compression could damage growing bones and organs. But these warnings were largely ignored. The beauty standard was too strong. Parents wanted their daughters to have tiny waists, to have the fashionable silhouette. So they put them in tight girdles, even knowing there might be health consequences. It's a genuinely disturbing form of child abuse, honestly, disguised as beauty maintenance. Now, let's talk about the silhouette itself and what it was designed to achieve. The medieval ideal body shape: tiny waist, pronounced curves, high chest, was designed to emphasize fertility and sexuality, while simultaneously making the body less functional. A woman with an extremely compressed waist and an exaggerated silhouette was beautiful, but she was also less capable of movement, labor, or independence. Her beauty was directly correlated with her physical limitation. This isn't accidental. This is a feature, not a bug. Making women less capable through beauty standards is a way of controlling them. Contemporary sources describe women's activities being restricted by their garments. A woman in a very tight girdle couldn't easily pick up a child or carry something heavy. She couldn't bend down to work in a garden. She couldn't run or climb stairs without difficulty. She couldn't ride a horse comfortably. Her restricted movement restricted her activities, which restricted her independence. She was beautiful, but she was trapped in her beauty. She was immobile, which meant she was dependent. This is how beauty standards function, as a form of control. The class dimensions of this are also important. Wealthy women could afford the most elaborate girdles, the most refined lacing systems, and the finest garments, and they would wear these more extreme versions, compressing their bodies more severely than poorer women could afford to do. So, the wealthiest women, the women with the most to prove, would have the most distorted bodies, the most restricted movement, the most obvious physical limitations. Their beauty would be purchased with the most severe damage to their physical functioning. And yet, or perhaps because of this, they would have the most status. The more damaged and restricted your body, the more beautiful and desirable you were considered. By the late medieval period, some women had developed quite severe physical deformities from years of tight girdles. Contemporary medical accounts describe women with permanently compressed rib cages, women with posture problems from years of enforced compression, women with chronic pain from damaged organs or deformed skeletons. Some women developed what was essentially a spinal curve from years of constrained posture. Others had organ damage that caused lifelong digestive or reproductive problems. They were still considered beautiful, still considered successful at meeting the beauty standard, but the price was paid in their bodies. And here's where it gets truly tragic. Women often passed this standard on to their daughters. A mother who had grown up in tight girdles, whose body had been permanently reshaped, would put her daughter in the same garments. She'd tighten her daughter's laces. She'd celebrate when her daughter achieved an impressively tiny waist. She'd teach her daughter that this was beauty, this was desirable, and this was what she needed to do to be valuable. She was perpetuating the system that had damaged her own body, passing the damage onto the next generation. Breaking that cycle wasn't really possible in medieval society because the beauty standard was too strong, too universal, too tied to a woman's value and survival. But let's talk about the actual garments themselves, because the girdle wasn't the only piece of clothing designed to reshape the body. The kirtles and gowns worn over the girdle were equally important to the overall silhouette, and the way these garments were constructed reveals a lot about medieval understanding of body manipulation and fashion. A medieval girdle was typically a fitted gown, often sleeveless or with short sleeves, worn over a linen chemise and under an outer gown or surcoat. The girdle was designed to be very fitted, especially through the torso and waist. According to contemporary sources, the girdle would be laced or buttoned tightly, creating a smooth, compressed silhouette. The front of the girdle would often have a seam running down the center, which could be used to create additional compression. The seam would literally pull the fabric inward, further flattening and compressing the torso. But here's where medieval tailoring gets genuinely sophisticated. Contemporary garments that survive from the period show evidence of complex construction techniques. Some girdles had multiple layers of fabric in the torso area, creating structure and support similar to boning. Some had seams placed strategically to create a particular silhouette. Some had triangular inserts of fabric placed to create specific shaping. Medieval tailors understood how to use seams, fabric placement, and garment construction to create compression and reshaping without needing explicit stays or bones. The effect of all these techniques combined the tight girdle underneath, the fitted girdle with its compressed seams. The strategic gore placement was a silhouette that was dramatically shaped and controlled. Contemporary artwork from the period shows women with impossibly tiny waists and exaggerated curves. Whether these depictions are entirely accurate or somewhat exaggerated is debated by historians, but contemporary written sources confirm that women were indeed achieving quite dramatic compression and silhouette changes. Now, here's something interesting. The girdle and the techniques used to create these silhouettes were precursors to what would later become the corset. Medieval girdles, with their tight lacing and strategic seaming, were the direct ancestors of Renaissance corsets, which in turn influenced Victorian corsets. So, in a very real way, medieval women invented the technology and the practices that would lead to centuries of even more extreme corsetry. They didn't invent the corset itself, but they created the framework, the techniques, and the aesthetic ideal that corsets would later perfect. What's also interesting is that this technology was developed and refined by women, for women. Medieval tailors were often men, sure, but the garments were designed in response to what women wanted and what women were willing to endure. Women knew what kind of compression and reshaping was possible. They wanted more extreme versions of it, so tailors created them. It's not a simple story of patriarchal oppression, forcing women into uncomfortable garments, though that was certainly part of it. It's also a story of women actively seeking out more extreme versions of beauty standards, of women pushing tailors to create more sophisticated compression garments, of women being complicit in their own physical restriction. But let's not minimize the oppression either. Contemporary sources make clear that women didn't have a choice about whether to wear these garments. If you wanted to be considered fashionable, if you wanted to maintain your status, if you wanted to be marriageable, you had to wear the appropriate silhouetting garments. Refusing to wear them wasn't really an option. It would mark you as eccentric or low status. So, while women might have been pushing tailors to create more extreme versions, they were doing so under duress. The choice to compress your body wasn't really a free choice. It was a choice made within a system that didn't allow for not making that choice. Now let's talk about the movement implications of all this. A woman dressed in the full medieval beauty standard, tight girdle, fitted kirtle with multiple layers and strategic seams, long heavy gown on top, was severely restricted in her movement. She couldn't bend at the waist without difficulty. She couldn't lift her arms above her head. She couldn't walk quickly or climb stairs without careful calculation. She couldn't ride a horse except at a walk. She couldn't work in fields or gardens. Her restricted movement effectively confined her to indoor, sedentary activities. She could sit gracefully, she could stand and pose, and she could walk slowly and deliberately. Those were her options for movement. Contemporary sources describe the deliberate, careful movements of fashionable women. A woman in full dress was supposed to move slowly, elegantly, with precision. Quick movements would look undignified. Energetic movement would reveal the artificiality of her garments, might cause seams to split or lacing to loosen. So, she had to move slowly, carefully, always conscious of her clothing and her body. This deliberate movement became part of her performance of femininity and beauty. She wasn't just wearing beautiful clothes. She was embodying a particular kind of movement, a particular way of existing in space. And here's the thing that gets really insidious. This restricted movement was read as beauty. A woman who could only move slowly and carefully was considered more beautiful, more refined, and more desirable than a woman who moved freely and energetically. The physical restriction that was caused by the beauty standard was interpreted as evidence of the beauty standard's success. She's so refined, so elegant, so beautiful. Look how carefully she moves. When actually, she's moving carefully because her body is compressed and restricted, and she has no choice. The restriction is being reinterpreted as refinement. This is where we really see how beauty standards function as a form of social control. By making beauty dependent on physical restriction, society was literally restricting women's ability to move, to work, to be independent. And then it was celebrating that restriction as beauty. Women were being constrained and then praised for how gracefully they accepted the constraints. It's genuinely diabolical when you think about it. What's also interesting is that this created a particular kind of labor market. If women couldn't move freely, couldn't do physical labor, couldn't work independently, then they needed others to do these things for them. Wealthy women had servants to do labor. They had attendants to help them move, to help them with basic tasks that their restricted clothing made difficult. This created economic dependency. A beautiful woman was necessarily a dependent woman because her beauty made her physically incapable of self-sufficiency. And this dependency was built into the system. It was a feature, not a bug. So let's think about what this meant across different social classes. A wealthy noblewoman in the most extreme version of the beauty standard elaborate girdle, a multiple layered kirtle and a long, heavy gown, would be almost immobile. She'd be completely dependent on servants. She'd have status, yes, but she'd have no actual autonomy. A middle-class woman might wear a less extreme version of these garments, able to move more freely, but still restricted. A poor woman would wear looser, simpler garments that allowed actual movement and labor. So, the beauty standard was also a class marker. The more restricted your movement, the higher your status. The freer your movement, the lower your class. This means that actual functionality, your ability to work, to move, to live independently, be literally marked on your body through your clothing. And this marking was permanent. Once you grew up wearing these garments, your body adapted to them. Your muscles developed differently. Your posture was shaped by years of compression. You developed the gait and the movement patterns of someone in restrictive clothing. Even if you suddenly had the freedom to wear looser clothing, your body would still carry the marks of years of restriction. Contemporary sources describe some fascinating examples of this. There are accounts of women who had been put in restrictive garments as girls, spent their entire lives in them, and then somehow found themselves with the freedom to remove them, perhaps after becoming a widow and having more autonomy, or after a significant life change. Some of these women chose to continue wearing the restrictive garments even when they didn't have to, because they'd become so accustomed to them that without them they felt exposed and unstable. Their bodies had literally changed to require the restriction. The beauty standard had become a physical necessity. By the Renaissance, this silhouetting technology had become even more refined. Garments specifically designed to create a particular silhouette were developed. The Spanish farthingale, a hoop skirt designed to create an exaggerated hip silhouette, emerged in the 16th century as a way to create even more dramatic body reshaping. The English farthingale that followed was even more extreme. These represent an evolution of the medieval girdle and kirtle techniques. They're using garment construction to reshape the body more dramatically. So in a sense, medieval women invented not just a fashion trend, but an entire technology of body control through clothing. They developed the seaming techniques, the compression methods, the structural approaches that would be refined and improved over centuries. They created the aesthetic ideal that the body should be dramatically reshaped and controlled through clothing. They established the practice that women should accept physical restriction and discomfort in the name of beauty. And they did this while their own bodies were being damaged by the process. It's a genuinely tragic legacy. Medieval women creating solutions to meet an impossible beauty standard ended up creating technology that would be used to constrain women for centuries to come. They weren't designing oppression deliberately. They were trying to survive within an oppressive system. But their solutions, their ingenious tailoring techniques, their compression methods, their silhouetting approaches became permanent fixtures of women's fashion and women's oppression. The corset, the girdle, the laced bodice, all of these are direct descendants of medieval innovations. Medieval women, trying to be beautiful, created the tools of their own long-term restriction. And here's the eerily persistent part. We still do versions of this today. Modern shapewear is basically a high-tech version of the medieval girdle. It compresses, it reshapes, and it achieves the effect of a particular silhouette. Women still wear it, still accept the discomfort, and still pass the expectation on to their daughters. We've just made it slightly less obvious. We don't call it a girdle anymore. We call it shapewear, or a waist trainer, or a compression garment. We've rebranded it as optional and modern, but the basic impulse remains the same. Reshape the body, accept discomfort and restriction, and achieve the fashionable silhouette. Medieval women figured this out, and we're still doing it. The methods have evolved, but the basic calculation beauty is worth physical restriction hasn't changed at all. Fabrics and colors. What silk, linen, fur, red, blue, gold said about you. All right, so we've talked about how the body was shaped and controlled through garments. Now let's talk about what those garments were actually made of, because fabric choice was absolutely critical to medieval beauty and status. In fact, your choice of fabric communicated information about your wealth, your status, your taste, and your moral character. You could literally read someone's social position from the material their clothes were made of. Let's start with something that seems straightforward. Linen. Linen is made from flax fibers, and it's a natural, breathable fabric that's relatively easy to produce. Because of this, linen was the most common fabric in medieval times. Most people wore linen for their undergarments and everyday wear. Linen was accessible, practical, and honestly, quite pleasant to wear. But here's the thing about linen in medieval culture. It was considered humble. It was the fabric of common people, of servants, of anyone who wasn't wealthy. A woman in all linen was signaling that she was of modest means. But linen had another role in medieval fashion that's actually quite interesting. It was associated with purity and cleanliness. The whiteness of linen was considered beautiful and virtuous. Linen undergarments were considered important because they were close to the skin and needed to be pure. And white linen, according to medieval theology, was associated with virginity and purity. So wearing white linen undergarments was a form of virtue signaling. Even poor women, unable to wear silk or expensive fabrics, could still signal purity and respectability through white linen. Contemporary sources describe the importance of visible white linen, the chemise visible at the neckline or at the wrists was an important element of a woman's appearance. It showed that you were wearing proper undergarments, that you were respectable, that you understood the importance of purity. But of course, wealthy women wanted to have their linen, and their silk too. So, elaborate garments often featured both. An outer gown might be made of expensive silk or wool, but the undergarments and the visible portions of the chemise would be fine white linen. This combination, expensive outer fabric with fine white linen visible underneath, advertised wealth, but also respectability and purity. It was the best of both worlds. You could display your wealth through your outer garments, while displaying your virtue through the white linen underneath. Now, let's talk about wool, because wool was the fabric of the middle classes and of more durable garments. Wool was relatively affordable compared to silk, but it was still considered more desirable than linen. A gown made from fine wool was a sign of moderate wealth. According to contemporary sources, wool was valued for its durability and its ability to hold dyes well, which meant wool garments could be vibrant colors. Wool also provided warmth, which linen didn't. So wool garments were practical for actual life in a medieval climate. But wool had a reputation for being practical rather than beautiful. A woman in a wool gown was comfortable and moderately wealthy. but she wasn't as fashionable as a woman in silk. Now, let's get into the really valuable fabrics. Silk. Silk was the ultimate status symbol in medieval fashion. It was expensive sometimes, as expensive as gold by weight, because it had to be imported from Asia over long trade routes. The production of silk was closely guarded. For centuries, Western Europe didn't know how to produce silk, so all silk had to be imported, which made it extraordinarily expensive and exclusively the domain of the wealthy and the nobility. Wearing silk meant you were announcing your wealth to everyone who saw you. According to contemporary sources, silk was so valuable and so tied to status that there were actually sumptuary laws that restricted who could wear what fabrics. In some medieval cities and kingdoms, there were specific rules about who was allowed to wear silk. In some places, only nobles could wear silk. In others, wealthy merchants might be allowed silk garments, but peasants definitely weren't. These laws were designed to maintain visible class distinctions. They were ways of using fabric choice to enforce and communicate social hierarchy. But here's where it gets really interesting. Silk wasn't just valuable because it was rare. It was valuable because of how it looked and felt. Silk has a particular sheen, a particular way it catches light and drapes. It feels smooth and luxurious against the skin. Wearing silk feels different from wearing wool or linen. It has a sensory richness that other fabrics don't. So, wealthy women who wore silk weren't just advertising their wealth. They were experiencing a genuinely different, more pleasant fabric experience. They were enjoying luxury in a literal, physical sense. Contemporary sources describe the sensory aspects of silk, how it drapes, how it catches light, how it feels. Women would spend enormous amounts of money specifically for the pleasure of wearing silk, of feeling silk against their skin, of seeing how it moved when they moved. This wasn't irrational. They were purchasing pleasure, luxury, and status all at once. The silk itself was the pleasure the way it felt, the way it looked, the way it made you feel when you wore it. Now, there were also imported fabrics that weren't silk, but still carried significant status. Damask, for example, was a figured fabric with patterns woven into it. It was expensive and beautiful, and often made from silk or a silk blend. Velvet was another luxury fabric. It had a pile that gave it a soft, rich appearance. Brocade was a fabric with raised designs, often featuring gold or silver thread. These fabrics were extraordinarily expensive and were typically worn only by the wealthiest people. Nobility, wealthy merchants, the upper clergy. According to contemporary sources, a single gown made from brocade or velvet could cost more than a year's wages for a servant. The fabric itself was the primary expense. The garment was essentially a way of displaying how much fabric you could afford to buy. Wealthy women would own multiple gowns in different fabrics and colors, changing their garments multiple times a day to display their wealth and their status. A woman in a brocade gown this morning and a velvet gown this afternoon was showing off, and everyone understood that she was showing off. That was the point. Now, let's talk about fur, because fur was another critical status marker in medieval fashion. In cold medieval climates, fur-lined garments were practical. They provided warmth. But fur was also a luxury item, and different furs communicated different statuses. According to sumptuary laws and contemporary sources, the type of fur you wore indicated your social rank. Ermine, which is white, with black-tipped tail hairs, was the fur of nobility and royalty. Only the highest-ranking people were allowed to wear ermine. Squirrel fur was acceptable for wealthy merchants and lower nobility. Common furs, like rabbit or hare, were worn by middle-class people. Ermine was extraordinarily expensive because the animals were small, and it took many of them to create a fur lining large enough for a garment. A single ermine fur coat could cost tens of thousands of dollars in modern money. But if you were nobility, if you wanted to display your rank, you wore ermine. An ermine had a distinctive appearance. The white with black spots was recognizable, unmistakable. Everyone could see that you were wearing the fur of royalty. You couldn't wear ermine without making a statement about your social position. What's also interesting is that fur was used for lining and trim, which meant it was visible and intentionally displayed. A noblewoman wouldn't hide her ermine lining. She'd arrange her garments so the white fur with its black markings was visible, catching light and drawing attention. The fur became part of the display, part of the advertisement of status. Contemporary artwork from the period often shows garments with fur trim carefully arranged to be visible and prominent. The fur wasn't just functional, it was a key part of the aesthetic display. But here's where it gets dark. The fur trade drove significant trade networks and economic systems. Animals were killed specifically for their fur, and the fur trade was brutal. Contemporary sources describe fur traders hunting animals to extinction in certain regions. The ermine, in particular, was hunted intensively to supply demand for noble garments. Birds were killed for their feathers, which were used for decoration and for trimming garments. The beautiful medieval fashion that we admire in artwork was supported by an enormous amount of animal death. And of course, sumptuary laws about fur restricted who could wear what. If you wore ermine, and you weren't nobility, you could face legal penalties. The fur on your garment was evidence of your social claim. If your claim was false, you were breaking the law. This meant that your clothing choices weren't just about aesthetics, or even about status. They were about legal compliance. You had to wear the right furs, the right fabrics, the right colors for your social rank, or you risked legal punishment. Now let's talk about color, because color choice was another critical element of medieval fashion and status. In the medieval world, color wasn't neutral. Different colors communicated different things about wealth, status, virtue, and profession. Red was one of the most expensive and desirable colors in medieval times. Red dye came from several sources: madder root, cochineal insects, or other materials, and the best red dyes were expensive and required expertise to produce properly. A vibrant red cloth was a sign of significant wealth. According to contemporary sources, red garments were worn by nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking clergy. A woman in a bright red gown was announcing her wealth to everyone who saw her. But there was also a moral dimension to color choice. Red was associated with luxury and sensuality, which made some religious authorities uncomfortable. There are accounts of priests warning against wearing red as sinful or immodest. Some religious women were forbidden from wearing red. So wearing red was also making a statement about your moral positioning. A woman in bright red was either wealthy enough to ignore religious warnings, or she was deliberately signaling sensuality and disregard for religious propriety. Either way, she was making a statement. Blue was another expensive color, particularly shades of blue, created from lapis lazuli or indigo. Blue was the color of nobility and of the Virgin Mary. A blue gown was both beautiful and morally significant. It connected you visually to the Virgin Mary and to the sacred. Wealthy women would wear blue, especially for important occasions or formal settings. According to contemporary sources, blue was considered one of the most beautiful and desirable colors. Gold and golden yellows were also expensive and desirable, created using saffron dye or other materials. Gold was the color of wealth, of divinity, of the highest status. A golden gown would announce significant wealth. Purple was another expensive color, created from murex snails or other sources, and it was traditionally the color of royalty and high clergy. Wearing purple without the proper status could get you in serious legal trouble. In contrast, common people wore undyed or poorly dyed fabrics, grays, browns, natural earth tones. These were the colors of poverty and low status. A woman in undyed wool or linen was signaling that she didn't have the resources to buy expensive dyes. Her clothing color itself was an advertisement of her poverty. Contemporary sources describe the stark visual difference between a wealthy person in bright red or blue and a poor person in gray or brown. The color difference was instantly readable, immediately communicating social status. What's particularly interesting is how these dyes affected the cost and availability of garments. A simple wool gown might cost a moderate amount, but the same gown dyed red would cost dramatically more because of the expense of the red dye. Dyed garments were so expensive that they often lasted longer, were passed down through generations, and were valuable items in estates and wills. A red gown might be mentioned specifically in a will as a valuable object. These weren't just clothes. They were investments, heirlooms, wealth stored in textile form. But here's where the color story gets really complicated. The production of expensive dyes involved significant labor and often dangerous conditions. The madder root that produced red dye required processing and expertise. The indigo that produced blue involved fermentation processes that could be noxious and unpleasant. The cochineal insects that produced brilliant reds were gathered from specific regions and had to be processed into usable dye. All of this labor, often performed by people in developing regions or by poor workers in European cities, was invisible to the wealthy women wearing the colored garments. But it was essential to their beauty. A wealthy woman in a brilliant red gown was wearing the invisible labor of dyers, of traders, of all the people involved in the supply chain. She was adorned by their work, their expertise, their sometimes dangerous labor, and she was probably completely unaware of it. She saw only the beautiful color and felt the pride of wearing expensive dye. The labor that created it was hidden from her view. Contemporary sources describe the dyers' guilds in medieval cities, organizations of skilled workers who controlled the dye production and maintained quality standards. These were powerful organizations because they controlled access to expensive colors. A dyer who could produce a particularly vivid red or a particularly stable blue had significant power in the market. They could charge high prices. They could maintain monopolies. The dyers themselves became wealthy from their expertise. But the work was difficult and often dangerous. Medieval dye production involved toxic substances, strong odors, and repetitive labor. Many dyers suffered from chronic health problems from exposure to dyes and chemicals. But I digress. The point is that color choice in medieval fashion was intensely tied to wealth, status, moral positioning, and labor systems. What color you wore literally communicated where you fit in society, and the wealthier you were, the brighter and more impressive your colors could be. Now, here's something interesting about combinations of fabrics and colors. Medieval fashion was often about layering and combination. A woman might wear a linen chemise, over which went a wool girdle, over which went a silk outer gown. Visible portions of each layer would show the white linen at the neckline and wrists, the wool girdle visible at the sides or front, where the outer gown opened, the silk outer gown in its dramatic color and sheen. The combination was intentional, carefully constructed to display as much wealth and status as possible. Contemporary descriptions of fashionable dress emphasize this layering and combination. A fashionable woman's appearance wasn't about a single garment. It was about the complex interplay of different fabrics, different colors, different textures, all visible at once. The combinations communicated information about wealth, taste, status, and aesthetic sophistication. A woman who understood how to layer and combine different fabrics and colors at an impressive level was demonstrating fashion knowledge and aesthetic judgment. That judgment itself became a marker of status. But here's the thing about this complexity. It required expertise to get right. You couldn't just throw on any combination of fabrics and colors and expect to look fashionable. You needed to understand color combinations, fabric textures, what layers would be visible, and what the overall effect would be. Wealthy women had servants and attendants to help them dress, people who understood fashion and could help them achieve the right look. They might also consult with tailors or with fashion advisors about the right combinations. Fashion knowledge became specialized, professional expertise. This created an interesting class difference in fashion competence. A wealthy woman with expert help and access to expensive fabrics and colors could achieve sophisticated, impressive fashion combinations. A poor woman dressing herself with limited resources and limited fashion knowledge would look simple and unsophisticated by comparison. Fashion became a visible display of not just wealth, but also of education, taste, and access to expert advice. Your ability to dress fashionably wasn't just about money. It was about knowledge and connections. Now, let's talk about the environmental impact of all these fabrics and color choices, because this is something that's often invisible in historical discussions, but is genuinely important. The production of silk involved massive environmental impacts in Asia. The extraction of natural dusties had environmental consequences. The hunting of animals for fur drove species toward extinction in certain regions. The transportation of these materials across long trade routes required ships and energy and involved significant environmental cost. The medieval fashion system that produced those beautiful garments we admire in artwork and museums was supported by environmental destruction that was already beginning to be visible in medieval times. Contemporary sources actually describe some awareness of these impacts. There are accounts of certain animals becoming rare or extinct due to hunting for fur. There's evidence that some regions were over-harvested for dye plants. Medieval people understood that their consumption had consequences, but the desire for beautiful, fashionable garments was strong enough that the environmental impact was largely ignored or accepted as the price of beauty. This is actually not that different from today, when we're aware that fast fashion has environmental impacts, but we continue consuming anyway. Medieval people were making the same calculation. Beauty and status are worth the environmental cost. What's also worth noting is how these fabrics and colors enforced and maintained social hierarchy. Sumptuary laws explicitly stated who could wear what. These laws were designed to prevent social climbing, to ensure that wealth couldn't be visibly disguised. That status would remain readable in clothing choices. If a merchant became wealthy, they might try to buy silk and wear it to signal higher status. Sumptuary laws prevented this. They required that even wealthy merchants wear fabrics and colors appropriate to their class. This meant that new wealth couldn't be visibly displayed. You had to be born into high status to have the legal right to wear the most impressive fabrics and colors. But of course, these laws were also frequently violated or worked around. Wealthy merchants would find ways to wear silk, perhaps by claiming it was for business purposes or by obtaining special permission. The laws were enforced inconsistently, which meant that in practice, wealth often could convert into fashionable appearance. But there was always risk and difficulty involved. A wealthy merchant wearing silk was breaking the law and risked legal punishment. This added an element of danger and transgression to fashionable appearance, especially for people trying to climb the social ladder. Now, here's the really fascinating part. Over time, these restrictions gradually eroded as trade became more developed, as more people became wealthy, as supply increased. The prices of silk and exotic fabrics gradually decreased. This made it harder to maintain the visual hierarchy that expensive fabrics had previously enforced. By the Renaissance, wealthy people from various classes could afford expensive fabrics. The visual distinction between nobility and wealthy merchants became less clear. This actually drove fashion innovation, as expensive fabrics became more accessible. New ways of distinguishing status through clothing had to be invented. More elaborate construction, more complex tailoring, and more extreme silhouettes. Fashion innovation was partially driven by the need to maintain visible class distinction as material goods became more accessible. This is an interesting parallel to today, as fast fashion has made trendy clothing accessible to everyone. Status distinction through fashion has become more complicated. Wealthy people now wear expensive designer clothing with visible logos and branding, because the logo itself becomes the status marker. The fabric matters less than the brand. Medieval people didn't have brand logos, but they were trying to solve the same problem. How do you maintain visible status distinction through clothing as the material goods become more widely available? The answer then was complexity and construction. The answer now is branding and logos. But the basic impulse remains the same. By the late medieval period, fashion was changing rapidly. New silhouettes, new fabrics becoming available, new colors possible through improved dye techniques. The fashion system was becoming more dynamic, more fast-changing, and more trend-based. This is actually the beginning of what we'd recognize as modern fashion. The idea that styles change seasonally, that fashion is something that constantly shifts, that keeping up with fashion requires constant consumption and updating. Medieval women were wearing beautiful garments made from expensive, luxurious fabrics and dyed in vibrant, impressive colors. These garments communicated their wealth, their status, their position in society. They were objects of beauty and of power, but they were also objects of oppression, visual markers of a rigid hierarchical system, visible proof of who had power and who didn't. You could read medieval society in the clothes people wore. The colors alone told the story of who had wealth and who didn't. And here's where it echoes into today. In a way that's genuinely eerie, we still read people's status from their clothing. We still understand that expensive fabrics and designer brands communicate wealth and status. We still accept that fashion is partially about displaying wealth and position. We're still participating in sumptuary systems, just invisible ones. Nobody officially forbids poor people from wearing certain colors anymore, but there are still informal status hierarchies communicated through clothing. A person in fast fashion polyester is still read differently than a person in designer silk. The visual hierarchy persists. The basic system, using fabric choice and color to communicate and enforce status, that system never really went away. We just made it less explicit, less codified into law, more about brand names and designer labels instead of fabric types and colors. But the fundamental calculus remains the same. Your clothing communicates your status, and people will spend significant money to ensure their clothing communicates the status they want to claim. Medieval women understood something important, that appearance matters, that what you wear communicates who you are and what your status is, and that investing in beautiful, expensive garments is investing in your position in society. They were right. The only difference is that we've made the system more subtle and more insidious. We've hidden the hierarchies beneath marketing and branding rather than encoding them in law. But the basic system of using clothing to communicate and enforce status, that's medieval. Medieval women invented it. Medieval people perfected it. And we're still living in the world they created. And so, the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night.